Does Linux has a headquarters?
No,
Because
unless it's my office, no. It's one of my jobs, actually, is to, when we have overarching issues like that, I mean, I ended up being pretty involved in the power, even though I'm not actually the power management maintainer. But at some point, we needed to re-architect things, and it touched every single driver we have. And we have hundreds of drivers. We probably have over 1,000. Greg would know exactly how many we have because he's the poor sap who maintains it. But it was really, really painful, and it literally was painful for a long time. But there's no centralized place really except for me and then the guy who was in charge. I've seen many open source projects that have a core group of people and kind of, like the Apache project, very successful. They always had a core group of people who together were the maintainer. And in Linux, we've never had that. I mean, we've had me, but at the same time, I'm not a very strong, I mean, I am kind of at the top, but I'm not a very controlling entity, right? All the sub-maintainers really do their work very independently. And we aim to kind of work together in a fairly fluid way. There's not strict rules about who can commit. I mean, that's one of the things that the whole distributed development model and having Git as a tool was literally designed to do well, that there is no central place, there's no need for a central controller because anybody can use it, and then they just ask each other to please pull in my changes. So Linux has been actually fairly unusual in open source projects in having this kind of not very strict like core maintainer team. We don't have the problem of having to kind of keep track of lots of people because it really is, almost nobody works with, me for example, I don't work with hundreds of people. There's every single release, there's 1,000 people, we do the statistics, so it tends to be really just around 1,000 people involved in making a release. I work with maybe 50. Those 50 people, they work sometimes with each other, so because you have different maintainers work in different pieces, but they have some interdependency. So they talk to each other too, but they also have their own group of people who handle that area. So our model really is, and it happened kind of by accident, but I think it's, in the end, it's not accidental. I think it's how people work. I think it's how people fundamentally are, like, that's, you have your family, you have your friends. You don't, I don't know about you, I have like a handful of really close friends that I trust. You don't have hundreds of friends. I mean, on Facebook you might have 100 friends, but they're not friends that you trust, right? The way we're wired, we have like these people we know and we trust. And it's, so I have these few maintainers I really trust well. I have a few tens of people I trust, but that they're kind of secondary. I'm not really that tightly with them. And they have their own people that they trust and work with. So it's more of this network of trust instead of having, it's not a hierarchy. Quite often when we, especially before, we used to write the whole, we try to explain how it works, right? And we do the traditional kind of, me at the top, and I have 5 lieutenants, and they have 5, and we made it look like a traditional CEO kind of model. And that's not how it really works. It really is more of a network. And so we don't have organizational problems because we don't have an organization. Or we do have one, but it's more in the connection between people than being something external. A lot of other people have connection to non-Linux projects in the tech world, like you. A lot of people here work for big companies like IBM or Intel, and they have connections to other projects. And I'm like, I've always said, okay, almost the only way I actually use Linux myself I mean, literally, my main use of Linux is I have a cell phone runs Linux, but I'm not actually involved in the development of that cell phone. And I have the laptops and desktops.
Do you think that this is an influence for the rest of the users? What you
No,
do?
my particular choice in distribution, and I've changed over time. I used to use SUSE 10 years ago, and then I switched to Fedora. Now, apparently I might be switching to Debian. Some things are changing, and the desktop, even though I have my complaints with GNOME 3, has in many ways gotten much better. But what I think is the bigger change is how people are using computers differently these days. We occasionally have subsystems where there aren't that many people who really know the code really deeply. And the rules in the code are so hard and so subtle that when an outsider touches the code, they will break things without ever even realizing. And the breakage is not necessarily very obvious either. It's like the code works. It's just that they introduced a really unlikely race condition where if two people do exactly the right thing, something bad happens. And sometimes the rules are even documented. So we may actually have the rules written down, but if they're complicated enough, people won't realize when the rules even apply and what locking you have to do and in which order and what operations work but are actually not safe to do. And we have a few subsystems where we have that kind of complexity. One of the ones that make me most nervous is actually the VM subsystem. Just memory management has always been complicated. This is not a new issue. Memory management has always been complicated. We were literally last week, we were discussing a bug that the three people who are like the most deeply involved in that subsystem had to spend 2 or 3 days trying to agree on how the bug could possibly happen, right? And if you have the 3 experts in the world looking at the code, knowing that the bug happens because we've seen the bug report, and trying to convince each other how it could have happened. And it takes them 3 days to discuss. That's a sign of something. What's fun is apparently the bug has been around for 5 years.
Okay.
Right. So it's not a new bug. It's not a new complexity. It is really, really, really unlikely that it will ever hit. You actually have to enable some very unusual config options for the bug to even show up. The reason it shows up now is that more people are starting to enable these config options. So it technically existed for 5 years. It just hasn't mattered. And it was hidden by the fact that most people wouldn't see it because it couldn't hit. But it's still a very subtle bug. And it's an example of a subsystem that is really important because everybody interacts with it. And it's a subsystem where we have a handful of really core people. I mean, it's one of the subsystems that I am involved with sometimes. Mm-hmm. I mean, we're talking people who've been involved in Linux for 15 plus years. Mm-hmm. We're talking maybe 5-10 people who are really core. And they spend 3 days arguing how it could happen. Most of the other subsystems are complicated in other ways at this time. It's the only thing that kind of worries me long term. We have a lot of small issues that we need to fix, right? I mean, we have bug reports that come up, and they're like short-term issues where we need to fix something. We have a new usage case that comes up, and we know that we don't perform as well as we could on that, and that some people care deeply about the performance for that case. Used to be something that worked half the time. Really, I mean, it never, 5 years ago, it never worked reliably, really, for anybody. And the reason was the event of suspending the machine impacted everything. There was not just the memory management side, but all the devices had to work correctly together. the bus subsystem had to suspend the devices in the right order because and we never really, we eventually got it right, but back then we didn't